How you doing? How are you doing?
Surviving.
Thriving,
Right
just
today.
surviving. So what my
Okay.
staff professor said one time is I'm surviving, not thriving. It's like, I don't want that to be my existence, I know.
We're gonna need that.
Okay, so I'll get us started unless anyone else was appointed as the moderator of this session. I'll be happy to be it. So today we're super lucky to have Nicole Bennett as our presenter. Nicole is a PhD candidate in the geography program. She studies digital technologies and data systems and how they influence the governance of migration and the delivery of aid. Nicole has a very long also professional experience in international development. Part of her dissertation was published in a recent article at The Conversation. If you have not read it, you have to read it. It has been widely consulted and cited. It is such an important intervention to see how data management is defining, surveillance nowadays. So please join me in welcoming Nicole today. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Like he said, I'm Nicole. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography. I also work full-time at the Kelley School of Business doing study abroad programming while I dissertate. And I also am the assistant director for the Center for Refugee Studies here on campus. And so I have many hats that kind of influence where I take my research and why I do it. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of present this work in progress. It's one of the chapters of my dissertation, and there are a couple of places where I'm a little, I would love to, any feedback anybody has or any additional readings or places you feel like the argument could be strengthened, I would really appreciate that feedback. So thank you for the opportunity. So today I'm going to talk about interoperability, and I want to talk about it as not this technical achievement that you hear about, but more of a governance project. So the way the state recognizes how it knows people and how it acts on that information and that knowledge. And part of my core argument that I'll walk through today, just to put it up front for you all to see, is that you'll see interoperability in technology getting sold as this modernization, this efficiency, breaking down silos, increasing integrity, helping efficiency, go faster. When I'm looking at these systems as a whole, I'm interrogating how these pipelines are letting data travel across agencies and domains and how this is actually building new institutional pathways for decision-making. And the thing that I will point to throughout the presentation is how this is increasingly mediated by private vendors. So I look a lot at Palantir and their software systems being embedded into ICE and DHS and the government. And so this talk, I break it down into three parts. I talk about interoperability as a governance buzzword that we've seen increase over time. And I'm going to define what I mean by interoperability and why it functions as this institutional technology. And then I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the digital self, which is one of the core pieces of my dissertation, how that identity can kind of become this everyday border side systems. So interoperability, it's one of those words that you hear all the time and it sounds self-evidently good. Public center money, of course, it's this cure for this diagnosis of slow government and siloed agencies, duplicated workflows, slow eligibility. And that, rhetorically, it matters because it frames data sharing as an administrative obvious thing to do, and something that's also politically benign. And kind of likening it to plumbing, right? Like, of course you should share data. It's just this thing that should happen. And so part of the argument I'm developing in this paper is that interoperability is not neutral. When you create this interoperability that makes cross-domain information move faster, it changes a lot of the way we govern. It changes what counts as a fact about a person, who can see that fact, who can act on it, and then what recourse exists if that fact is wrong. And it's different if you're a US citizen versus a non-US citizen. My is the US for the most part. So I want to start by treating interoperability as a governing language. This serves to legitimate cross-domain access. It makes it look like common sense instead of this reallocation of authority and risk. And that's kind of my broad arguments. So I want to start by showing it's really, I think, clear example of interoperability shifting from aspiration to mandate. So this is the 2025 White House executive order. It's titled Stopping Waste, Fraud, and Abuse by Eliminating Information Silos. And I don't have all the text up here because it's quite extensive, but it directs agencies to remove barriers so designated officials have full and prompt access to unclassified records, data, and IT systems, or an equivalent data set so that nothing can delay access. And this is not just about having better IT. This is a governance directive about who should have access to the data, for what purposes, and how quickly. And notice what, if you read through the whole thing, and even a little bit up here, what work that's doing here. It's talking about speed and access and consolidation. So the institutional action is not just sharing, it's restructuring access. It's normalizing the idea that barriers to sharing are unnecessary. So for my purposes, this executive order here is a really great example by what I mean of interoperability as a governance project. So it pushes that system towards the cross-domain accessibility as an administrative good, even though cross-domain access also redistributes power. And this isn't the only place we see it. I have an example here from the executive order that created Doge, and there's an excerpt promoting interoperable agency networks. There's the DoD. U.S. Department of War now released a strategy back in 2024. Part of the purpose was enhancing interoperability across IT systems in order to enhance productivity and user experience. You also see the CDC pushing for it, so looking to promote public health interoperability for a variety of reasons. And so you just see this shift, the last 10, 15 years, and really, the last year and a half, it's becoming more and more this push to create this interoperable network across the US. Two additional policy lanes that I think are really helpful, and I pull from them throughout my paper, is the idea of this, the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, colloquially known as the Evidence Act. This formalizes agency data governance leadership, and in the statute's description of the chief data officer functions, there's explicit responsibilities pulled out here for managing data assets, including standardizing data format and sharing data assets. Now, we all work with data all the time. Like, standardizing data is sometimes really difficult, and it involves a lot of choices that people are making, and those choices are steeped in historical reasonings behind those choices. And I'll talk about some of why this matters here in a second. The other policy lane that I point to throughout is the Real ID Act, which has been big in the news recently, but ever since it came in, year was that 2015 to I forget exactly what year this was first proposed, but it embeds interoperability without saying that actual word. It's talking about federalism, right? So it requires states through this interstate compact or agreement to provide electronic access to information that's contained in other states' motor vehicle databases. So it's all about making it readable across data sets for a variety of reasons. And when I put all these together, I'm noticing this broader pattern. It's this expectation that interoperability will happen. That's what the government is pushing for. You see it across other institutions as well. The standardization of formats, the sharing of access, linking databases together. And that to me is why this interoperability as a buzzword matters right now, because it's coming out as it's common sense modernization. Why would you not do this? And it's quietly building these infrastructures where this becomes routine. It's expected. Before we get too far into it, I want to define what I mean by interoperability. I quite like IBM's. They have a whole webpage on interoperability and what it means. And this is more the surface level meaning. It's this, it kind of contains the seeds of the governance problem I'm trying to point to. So it defines it as a standards-based approach to enabling different IT systems to exchange data and share functionality with minimal end user intervention. Two phrases here that matter to me. The whole webpage does, but in this talk specifically, standards-based. That's one of the phrases, meaning interoperability depends on shared formats and shared semantics. So agreements about what data is and how it's structured. And then the other part of that is the minimal end user intervention. That to me signals that the goal of this process is this kind of frictionless exchange where humans don't have to negotiate or translate data or even like re-enter information. It's just that is what it is, and that is the truth. That is what you should, take it at face value. And so in government systems, when we talk about minimal end user intervention, to me, that means less visible discretion. So that decision making is being baked into those standards or those defaults, the workflows that you see, or the platforms that are being used. And so I do treat this as a surface level definition of interoperability because that's how the term circulates. And I think this is how people think about it when it's being used in policy. But to open up that more analytically, I think about interoperability in this paper as a bundle of institutional and technical arrangements that are kind of used all together in a stack to create the process of interoperability. So I have 4 up here. I'll talk through them briefly. So standards and semantics, the shared vocabularies, exchange packages in data. The National Information Exchange Model is a really great example because it's specifically designed for enterprise-wide exchange standards and processes across the government. So that's, the Bureau of Justice Assistance tends to use this. Identity keys, so things like fingerprints, driver's license numbers, case IDs, any identifier that makes the linkage of data possible across systems. So you'll hear a lot about biometric data and things like that. That's one of the tools. Access architectures, so ways of ensuring access, even if direct system access isn't granted. So go back to the White House executive order where they talk about equivalent data sets. And so things that we can do to kind of make, if you don't have access to some information, how can you kind of create that access in a way that's not violating classification laws? And then where I tend to situate my research is in the procurement platforms and external vendor area. So the third-party vendor tools and contracts that are then embedded into governance systems. So like I said earlier, I studied Palantir a lot and the Gotham software that they tend to use, but also some of the external applications that ICE uses for monitoring protesters and monitoring people. And so that's where kind of where I sit in this when I look at this as a governance problem. And so for me, interoperability is not just this like pipeline, it's setting standards. It's setting standards, it's creating these identity keys that flow across space and time. It's built into access design, and then it's built into these, private softwares that are becoming more and more embedded into our government. So that's, for me, where I'm thinking of it as an institutional technology. I'm excited to come here in front of you all because, just the work that the Ostrom workshop does on different types of governance, I would love to have a discussion about that at one point. So I alluded to this at the beginning, but the core claim that I have in this paper is that interoperability is an institutional technology. I'm kind of working from that claim with the rest of my argumentation. And so what I mean by this is that interoperability reorganizes governance by shifting where authority sits and how discretion operates. And then there's an additional piece of accountability. So who bears accountability when something goes wrong, especially when you have a third-party vendor coming into the decision-making process who wasn't necessarily an elected official, or maybe it's proprietary software. And like, or maybe you're purchasing a private data set, and that the argument could be made there that you're circumventing Fourth Amendment due process rights to get data that the government typically would have had to get a warrant for. And so if interoperability makes this kind of cross-domain information travel, it's not just speeding up administration. Right? And I have some of the things that it is doing here. It's expanding who can access information, changing what categories are legible, moving choices into standards and software, and then redistributing that responsibility across agencies and vendors. So the big question for me is, what kind of governance is this building? Because a lot of times you'll hear the question is, does it work? Is it more efficient? Probably it's making something more efficient, but but what kind of governance is this actually building, and how is it changing the way we interact in society? I wanted to point to some of the really big pieces of work that I draw on too in this paper as a theoretical foundation. So I have some of the authors listed here, but I talk about, to make this concrete, these four anchors, Starr's work on infrastructure. She talked about if you study a city and ignore its sewers and power supplies, you miss the distributional politics and the planning politics and the planning power that's embedded in like those boring layers, which one could argue that database architecture is one of those boring layers. In terms of classifications and standards, carry moral and political weight. That's what Boker and Starr show in their book, in a lot of their work. But every standard valorizes some point of view and silences another. It's all a choice. And that produces advantage, or it could produce suffering by design. Some other work that I pull from is the privatization of regulations. So how authority can move into private rulemaking organizations when governments delegate and depend on technical expertise and capacity in that third-party software where you have to have someone who knows how to run that and operate that. And then if that person does not work for the government, what happens if that becomes so embedded in your governance structures that now that private vendor can charge whatever they want and kind of hide behind this black box of algorithmic happenings when accountability comes to call? And then there's this code argument too, Lessig's code argument, which is, behavior is regulated by architecture as well as law. So the code and design of your environments also tend to regulate the behavior of the environment you're in. Code Space is another really great book that kind of talks about that in an airport sense. And so while I'm pulling from these, it really is helping me work through the arguments of interoperability governing through infrastructure and classification and architectural constraint, often all at the same time and in different layers that kind of pop up at different points of the data life cycle. The second piece of this paper pulls in the digital self, which is something that I lean really heavily on in my research. So I see the digital self as this kind of composite identity that's an administrative in form. And it's made up of, biometric identifiers, records in multiple systems, classifications and risk markers, and vendor integrated data sets. So I don't know about you all, but I used to have Instagram. I really enjoyed the targeted ads. They were spot on. You know what I mean? Like they were good at what they were meant to do. What happens when the government now can purchase data sets like that can kind of predict what you like or what you'll do? And so this is kind of where, when I'm looking at the digital self, it's all these pieces that were not necessarily put together, but now interoperability is making it much easier for these, for lack of a better word, dossiers of a person to exist. And for me, it's really important that it travels across domains. So work, welfare, policing, Instagram, social media, your shopping data at a grocery store. And it's increasingly being used as this eligibility marker and sometimes even to be used as an investigative lead. And so once interoperability exists, that digital self can become more mobile than the person. I'm a geographer, so I think of things in terms of space and mobility. But that digital self is more mobile than the person in some ways. It can be copied, it can be queried, it can be scored, it can be flagged, it can be matched. And oftentimes you don't know that that's happening. And then say you go to an airport and they flag you, you don't know why. Sometimes what's the recourse for that? That's kind of the most salient example I can think of here in this moment, but where that fact is coming from, what information was fed to make that happen. And so I describe the digital self in geographic terms as this new border inside everyday systems. So it is a moving threshold. It is attached to the digital self as it moves, and that changes over time depending on the information that's being fed into it. And so I do tend to connect this to surveillance scholarship. There's this idea of a data double. Haggerty and Erickson. So they look at a surveillance assemblage that abstracts bodies into data flows and then reassembles them as data doubles elsewhere. These virtual representations that can be acted on. And then even more recently, Sarah Legeson captured the governance problem. So this idea that these data doubles are very powerful in shaping access to a variety of services like housing or welfare, employment, credit, all these different services, while also at times being inaccurate or incomplete. I don't know about you all, but I rarely have a large data set that's 100% accurate. There's always something I need to fix, or there's missing data that I need to infer. And so when we start applying that to social situations, what kind of governance is that pulling in? And so my bridge here is that interoperability is what is making this digital self-travel. So that scholarship that I have up here and that I write about in the paper, kind of walking through why that traveling representation becomes this governance object with real consequences and how hard it is to correct that narrative if it's wrong. And I have some cases up here. I don't actually know what time it is, but oh, it's up there. Okay, cool. I'm gonna go through a couple of the cases that I'm thinking of to put in this paper.
Could you say something a little more about data doubles? What are data doubles?
Yeah, so
Sorry.
no, absolutely. Data doubles, it's kind of like that's a great question. It's kind of like the digital self in a way, but it's like it's like the first step. So it is this, in maybe a concrete example, in a database that ICE is using, for example, they are pulling in potentially, some of that FAFSA data, for example. They can pull in tax data, they can now pull in Medicaid and Medicare data. Some of those silos are breaking down. And so these pieces of information that were never linked before, when you break them down into their smallest possible pieces and then join them together, they're saying, oh, this is Nicole. Like this is what she did on her taxes. This is what she said on her FAFSA. I mean, we used to encourage students who were undocumented to fill out FAFSA forms and put some of the information in there. And so when you're starting to connect these and it's creating this digital profile of you that serves as a double, what does that mean? So that's what they theorize on is how that is happening and what are some of those things that are happening. They look more on the consumer. They touch a lot on the consumer side, but it's a fascinating read. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So I talked a little bit about the National Information Exchange model earlier I touched upon it. And like to think about this model because for me, it shows interoperability as something broader than migration management, which is where I typically sit. And so this is a partnership between the Department of Justice, the DHS, and HHS, and it's designed to support enterprise-wide information exchange standards and processes. And so what it does is it has explicitly shared semantics. So what are the common meanings? What are the data formats? Let's set this consistency across all of these partners so that we can share information more easily. This also travels across welfare and services. So the Administration for Children and Families describes this as being architecture is being used by child welfare agencies and human service groups, so courts or schools, sometimes health providers, to exchange information. And so you have the DOJ and DHS using these standards. You have, courts or schools or health providers also using some of these standards. And so this to me makes interoperability seem like day-to-day operations and not this exceptional thing that we're starting to do of making all of these things pieced together. Because once standards make these fields and categories more portable, then you can, the information that's produced for one purpose, so healthcare or childcare, can then be imported and used in like a criminal context or in by DHS, for example. So I have a couple of cases, but I'm thinking about pulling this one in heavily because it's, for me, governance through standardization, so that's shared language. And so when you're building new data sets, what happens, or like what are some of the choices that are being made? Because I mean, when we all do research, we have different categories in our research because we have very explicit things we're trying to research. The same with government services. Things that education is collecting is different than what the DOJ is collecting, is different than what healthcare services are collecting. So what are we doing by standardizing that across the board? Like, we in our research all had to use the same kind of data formats and standardizations. What that do to our research is kind of like where my mind goes with this case. Second case I'm thinking of pulling in are biometrics, which tend to be talked about widely in the media and in scholarship as well. So this idea, talk about those 4 pillars, but the master key. We are connected. I am connected through all of these by my fingerprints because it stabilizes my identity across all of them. So I have a couple of places I'm looking here. So on the FBI side, they have a fingerprint database. And then on the DHS side, they also had a fingerprint database. One used 2 fingerprints, one used 10 fingerprints, just historically. And they came to an agreement where they now both use the 10 fingerprint method. And so that was then used to create this program called Secure Communities. Has anybody heard of that? It's not operational anymore. As of 2021, but it was a Department of Homeland Security program that was designed to identify immigrants in U.S. jails who were deportable under immigration law. And so it began in 2009. It was replaced by another system in 2015. It was brought back by Donald Trump in 2017, and then it was shut down by executive order, and then it was shut down in 2021. But under that program, participating jails had to submit arrestees' fingerprints not only to criminal databases, but immigration databases as well. And that allowed ICE to access information on individuals held in jails. And so at first it was a voluntary thing. When it came back in 2017, one of the orders was that it was mandatory and there could be fines if you didn't submit the fingerprints. So what it did was it gave ICE this technological, not physical presence in jails. And when I'm using it in this paper, I'm thinking of that single identifier, that fingerprint, as becoming the key that links criminal custody to immigration screening, and how like this data across time turns into like this way to govern. And I know we typically use fingerprints in a lot of different areas to govern. There's actually some really interesting literature on people resisting to fingerprint technology and what they do. Just a variety of different things that they resist that technology, that if anybody wants to talk about that at a later time. So this is kind of where I sit typically looking at Palantir and the Gotham platform. So I have a couple of screenshots that I'm going to show you. This is all from their homepage. Your software is the weapon system. This is what their example looks like of how to use it. It can get pretty granular. If you notice up here on the left, this is for drone technology. And you can even see, when they're talking about it in a war scenario, powering the campaign. But if you look down here, you can see the word interoperable. So the more I look in different places, the more this argument is coming in from the people who are selling the software themselves. Palantir, it's not just Gotham. They have quite a few different pieces of technology that they are in contract with the government for a shocking amount of money. One of the ones I focus on is Gotham. Another one I focus on is their investigative case management, which ICE uses to through Gotham. They're all, but it's configured for Homeland Security investigations and their operational needs. So there have been lots of privacy impact assessments done on some of these technologies, and the DHS did one, and it described the investigative case management as one of the core law enforcement case management tools that ICE uses. And then when we look at some of that contract metadata between Palantir and the US government, we see that that relationship is being built in as this long duration infrastructure. Because once these systems are built in, it's politically costly to take them out. You know, if the talking point by a politician is, oh, we found this threat, we eliminated this threat within a matter of 30 minutes, everybody is safer. How do you argue against that, you know, in a political space? We can in an academic space or in an advocate space, but it becomes politically costly to kind of untangle ourselves from this. And so interoperability, it's not just happening through policy, it's also happening through procurement and through these platforms that become that environment where data is linked and visualized. I mean, this is like geographic in nature because it's what they're showing us on their website. A lot of times FOIA requests are very difficult when it comes to this kind of thing. You can usually get operating manuals for the technology, but you can actually like see. It's very hard to find like a picture of what it actually looks like, what that dashboard looks like. And so the reason I am thinking of using this case study is because, again, these are all design choices that are being made, what data they're using, how the color choices, what hotspots, what data they're using to create those hotspots. It's all a choice. And in this case, it's a choice by a third-party vendor. It's not necessarily by who are working for the US government or, you know, even subject to scrutiny by elected officials. Yes, so that's where third parties are deciding what can be joined and what can be searched and how we're kind of experiencing the world through data dashboards and technologies. Yes. The fourth case study I'm thinking of using is it's called Falcon, and it is I'm thinking of using it in terms of analytic governance. So what this does is it's a system that enables ICE personnel to store and analyze and visualize information to support enforcement and investigations. And what's interesting is in the paperwork about this system, it explicitly says Falcon accesses and stores personally identifiable information that's retrieved from DHS, other government agencies, and commercially available databases. And so the reason this, again, raises red flags for me is because these data sets that are for purchase often contain information that the US government would have needed a warrant to get. And there's starting to be an increase in scholarship around how data brokers and the purchasing of data sets are circumventing people's Fourth Amendment due process rights here in the US. And so for me, this is the digital self in practice, right? This system that's built to produce leads, investigations, or discover connections. And even if individual analysts are still making the judgment calls, it's those platform structures that are giving them the leads. Like, here is what you can see. Here are the connections. That's another part of Gotham. What they advertise is you don't need new data sets. You can just implement this software and it breaks down your available data into the smallest forms, and then it reconnects them, and then it uses algorithms to weight relationships into this relational mapping engine. And so it's an algorithm that's been coded and kind of gives you the weight of, oh, well, this person, you know, may want to concentrate more on this person based on a variety of things, location at a protest, you know, what they were searching for on the internet, depending on what commercially available data set is available for purchase. And so this is where interoperability is not just exchange, it's this production of actionable representations. So those relationships that they're kind of mapping out using combination of government data and private data. Can find a good picture for this one, so I use a decision tree here, but have any of you heard of the risk classification assessment that has been used by ICE? Yeah, it was pretty big I mean, it's still being used, but there was a lot of hullabaloo around 2012 around this technology because it described the testimony from the DHS that describes this tool as intended to improve transparency and uniformity while in detention custody, and to make classifications decisions about people using what they call objective criteria related to public safety. And so the important thing for me here is that in their testimony, they talked about how this tool automates based on existing rules that ICE has in place and not through machine learning. So a lot of what I've shown you so far, some of the question is the algorithmic process and how different things are being weighted. But this is only automating human defined rules. And so this matters to me, case study, because even without machine learning, this rule automation can shift governance by, you know, you're still structuring the inputs that are going into the system. You're still constraining the workflows or institutionalizing pathways. You know, even some of the recommendations that are coming out, when you give something a strict set of rules, the world doesn't necessarily operate in these strict sets of rules. So this happened something that's not necessarily black and white. And so automation, I'm thinking about pulling this into the paper because when I'm thinking about automation, it's not necessarily intelligent. It's the centralization of knowledge. How do you even design a database, or how you're designing these can kind of limit what you're able to ask, how you use that data. Then I have just one last case. The interoperability by purchase. And so this again is kind of what we were talking about, that state market integration. So there was a Office of Inspector General for the DHS. There was an audit that found that Customs and Border Patrol, ICE, and the Secret Service did not adhere to policy privacies because they were purchasing and using commercial telemetry data. And they came to the finding that before you procure privacy sensitive technology or data, you kind of have to think about it, and you kind of have to do the work to make sure things are kept safe or how things are being used. And the ACLU, they accepted a FOIA request, and they found records that describe DHS buying access to large volumes of cell phone location data that were quietly extracted from phone apps, which is just another example of stepping the Fourth Amendment due process that people in the US have a right to. And it's actually still an ongoing court case as of today in New York. And then I also have this Office of the Director of National Intelligence. There's this intelligence community framework that defines what commercially available information is. And it also is acknowledging privacy and civil liberties risks, but it's evidence that these commercial purchases are a governance issue. Right? Like, how are we doing this? Why are we doing this? What avenues are we doing this through? And so this alternative path around interagency agreements is what we're seeing them purchasing these large data sets that have already been aggregated. And once you have either commercially available data sets incorporated or you're using a third-party software, what happens to that accountability? Like if it's the algorithm, you you're flagged. You're like, well, what happened? Why am I flagged? Well, the algorithm told me, or this is the output that the system gave me. How did it get to that? Oh, well, we can't tell you. It's proprietary software. Even we don't have access to how it came up with this. We can, like it's much harder to interrogate some of these data systems than it would be if you were in front of a person with all of your documentation and they were to look at it and you can have a conversation with that person. So it just makes it much harder to see and much harder to contest. I'll be cognizant of time because I think I was supposed to stick to
We have
30
5
minutes.
more minutes. I think, 40 and yeah.
Okay. And so along those lines of error being harder to locate and contest, we have a couple of examples where US citizens, the top one, US citizens were mistakenly identified as foreign nationals and detained by ICE or held by CBP. And so, the Government Accountability Office has found this. I mean, so have a lot of advocacy organizations, but it's a widely recognized issue that has been happening. And what's interesting is that ICE doesn't systematically track those errors or those encounters, according to this report. And so again, when we're thinking about data as a governance tool or things that can be used when you are not collecting data, that can have, a huge impact, just like collecting certain types of data. Because if they're not systematically tracking their errors, it's harder to contest, oh, this is a system-wide failure and not just, oh, this happened one time, right? Because all those different cases have to find each other. The second one I have up here is the GAO's work on terrorist watch listing. They've emphasized that misidentifications happen, and for US citizens, you can go through DHS for travel related watch list issues if they say, oh, you're a terrorist, but for non-US citizens, there's no recourse. And even for US citizens, that recourse looks different depending on the day you go in. I mean, it's so subjective, that process, according to the Government Accountability Office. And so one of the things that they suggest in this report is, let's take a look at this broader systemic issue, and we need to have more ways to hold the system accountable. Like, what can people actually do if they think that the flag or the put on the terrorist watch list is incorrect? What can you do? That should be a very easy and clear process. And then the Privacy Act, which this kind of complicates, well, it provides access and amendment rights, but it's kind of complicated because it shields disclosure when disclosure of information could impede law enforcement investigations. And so again, in a lot of these use cases that we're talking about, whether it's immigration enforcement or whether it's, flying and terrorist watch lists, a lot of the argument from the system side is this is a law enforcement proceeding. So, we have this shield that we don't have to necessarily tell you what data were used or how it was used or what the choices were. And so this is where we see that due process kind of thinning out in that institutional sense, because it's hard to access the system, it's difficult to interrogate it, and then sometimes a lot of times, I would argue harm is occurring faster than accountability or correction can occur, which creates this kind of lopsided, because when all these systems are connected and it's multiple systems, you don't know which system made the error. It's hard to look into that as an individual person with regular means. So, in conclusion, I started out talking about how interoperability gets framed as efficiency, but that I wanted to move forward this argument of interoperability as governance by infrastructure. And I had those 4 things at the beginning: the standards, counting what's fact, keying systems, making identity portable so the fingerprints are biometrics, platforms and vendors mediating that environment. And so this production of the digital self and how that portable identity that's administrative in nature moves across domains, and that is what's used to decide your risk or your credibility, or like, are you suspicious, or even what recourse you have in the data. And so really my overall is that interoperability is not always bad, but it is not neutral. And what it does is it serves to reorganize authority. It changes where we can look for accountability. And it's really hard to see that when we're looking at that surface level definition of interoperability, and we're looking at it just through the lens of modernization and efficiency. And so I'm toying around with being with like what I would look for in terms of like a contestable interoperability. And I have some things here that are more like technical in nature, depending on how the paper goes, which I'm happy to talk through those, but I'm also cognizant of time. And that's my last slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much for sharing parts of your super important work. Sometimes, you know, it's like a Philip K. Dick moment, and sometimes it is Black Mirror kind of stuff. Super important. Thank you so much. Rather than saying that we will start with grad students, that, you know, sometimes I think it is a good idea to remind us that this is a workshop. Workshop is for building together, tinkering ideas. So the idea of a workshop is that with your questions, with your comments, we build together. So that implies, you know, being respectful of each other's work and, you know, engaging into comments that can be constructive, rather than saying, you know, grad students go first. But yes, grad students go first as part of, you know, how we try to really make this a space as a space for building ideas. So if you are a grad student and have a question, you can go ahead, and we will have to check what is happening online as well.
So thank you. I really appreciate you guys coming in and listening.
Just I wanted to mention a little bit of experience. So about, I guess, 7-8 years ago, used to work for Rutgers University, and we consulted one of the government agencies, one who had a huge warehouse of people outside of Washington, D.C., whose job was to ensure that only some US citizens can work as stewardesses or baggage handlers and whatnot. There is, you know, in this country, something called WIC, Transportation Worker Identification Card. And to be eligible for one has to prove that one is not crazy, one is not an illegal alien, and one is not criminal. And the definition of criminal is federal. It's like 27 or 29 grounds of disqualification described in federal terms. It had to be mapped to state terms in all 56 jurisdictions. Okay, so those adjudicators, of course, they have a system when basically they get what do you call it, rap sheet from the NCIC, what is it called? I know the NCIC, I suppose, the database at the FBI. They read it and they try to understand whether a particular state charge maps to a particular federal level of federal ground of disqualification, or it doesn't. And of course, sometimes they have questions. The questions go to a higher up, then to a higher up in that system. And finally, there is like sort of the top honcho, the main expert on those things, who writes a response. And then those responses are compiled, and they have a manual about like 500 pages. And there are very interesting things there to see how various data quality issues are dealt with. A lovely one was this. Like there was a description of the code describing somebody's country of birth, you know, two-digit codes, the UK or GB for Britain, D for Germany and whatnot. And was a footnote. South Georgia is an island with no population. Therefore, anybody whose country of birth is labeled as South Georgia probably was born in the United States. This kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that this question that you raise of, you know, you have federal data standards, and then you need to map them onto each of the 50 states.
56, well states, federal jurisdiction, and territories.
Sure. And I think that's a really interesting example. Did you say TRIP, TRIP? Is that the authorization?
TWIC, Transportation Worker Identification Card. You can look it up. There are a lot of documents from GAO, Government Accountability Office, I guess you call it these days, used to be called Government Accounting Office, describing the redress system, because people apply, takes it, well, in my days, it was like a decade ago, of course, took forever to adjudicate. Then maybe people say, I'm not really disqualified because like it's not a real conviction. And then there is an issue like how different states code arrest, conviction, dispositions, and whatnot, because it's all slightly different in physics jurisdictions, of course. Plus, there are foreign ones obtained through what called legal attaches in foreign embassies. There are immigration data as well, though it's only certain types of interactions are there. So it's quite. Oh yeah, and another funny thing about the same data quality. So there is the State Department every year publishes tables describing in particular how many visas were issued of different classes to nations of different countries. And one of those reports had an interesting footnote. Basically, what happened was the number of visas issued supposedly to the citizens of Dominica, and Dominica is a tiny island smaller than Monroe County, was greater than the total population of Dominica. And the footnote explained, well, I guess basically it's likely that some of the visas issued to the citizens of Dominican Republic, which was a much bigger country, were miscoded as associated with Dominica.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of data quality, I mean, I said it before, like when we are using large data sets, there's often missing data, or if we didn't collect it ourselves, there's lots of different explanations. And so when we embed that into governance structures, data quality is a huge, when you hear it talked about in mass media or even in these policy documents, it seems like a very systems interoperable, but there are a lot of choices that come with that. Yeah.
Patricia, then Jess, then Mati.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I have two questions.
We will connect some, so yes.
Okay, so when interoperability became famous, if my memory is correct, was after 2011 attacks. And it was sold as something good, as something efficient, as you mentioned, right? And somebody said, let's interconnect, let's make interoperable all the sectors from the critical infrastructure. So if something bad happens, we can handle everything well, until somebody said, maybe that's not a good idea, because if you hit on one sector, then we are going to have a domino effect because everything is interoperable, right? So my first question is, you spoke in terms of error, but do you foresee a similar idea, similar concept happening in terms of all these agencies that are exchanging data?
Are you talking about data security?
Yeah. I mean, it's
Cybersecurity.
It's a cybersecurity idea, right? When you hit one sector, if this is interoperated to more things, everything is going to collapse. And second, and this is a very straightforward question, is what these agencies are collecting is data or metadata? Because in terms of legal remedies, you can do something to protect your data. You can fight legally, but when it's metadata, the thing becomes tricky. It's not as equally protected as the data.
Can I answer this?
Let's collect some questions. We cannot go over time because it's how it is presenting. So I want you to get all of the questions.
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna try to limit it to two. One is a very technical question, clarification, and it builds on Patricia's question, which is, it seems like there is a difference between interoperability and actual data sharing, right? Like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is definitely not my area, but interoperability seems like it's the possibility or the capacity for data sets to be used over different systems or different systems to be shared. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will be. Right. And so I guess I'm curious if you're making that differentiation, because that would seem to have pretty significant and helpful conceptual differentiations between like power, right, and technology, right, or infrastructure as your data. So that's the first one. The second one builds off of that, which is a broader question of thinking about like how you are thinking about governance as it relates to these questions, because you used it a lot. And of course, we're here in the workshop. But I would love to hear you think about that, because one thing, sticking with Diana's sort of like highlighting of workshopping ideas that would be interesting is to think about how does so you've got these interesting cases, but how does interoperability affect the extractive capacity of the government, the maybe an administrative or goods provision capacity of the government, and then a repressive or coercive capacity of the government? Because as you said, right, it's not neutral, but it may have really different kinds of ways in which it plays out for those functional dimensions of traditional state apparatus, which we could definitely push against. But as an organizing framework for thinking about, you're kind of thinking about the politics of interoperability, right? In some ways, right? If it's reallocating authority, that's what it's doing. And so thinking about how that plays out maybe in each of these functional dimensions of government might be one way of advancing your argument. Again, just a workshop idea.
Quickly, Mati, I think was next, yes, and then.
Thanks for your presentation. My first question is that, I mean, data interoperability, I mean, it could be, as you mentioned some of the benefits of data interoperability. Do you think data interoperability could help the results of, I mean, whatever that people do, be reproducible and replicable? You know, because they're using the same standard structures, and whoever used it could help. I mean, people or government that have the same results, because it's so important to have the reproducibility and replicability of the results. And my second question is, I mean, if we think further, do you think interoperability could, I mean, somehow serve national security? I mean, the security of the United States, because they could use it to, I mean, eliminate potential dangers that could affect US citizenships at least.
Your question, and then and then we'll Nicole the possibility to answer. I think we will have to continue the conversation to.
Sure. So I'm kind of interested, you were thinking about the remedies for how this works, and there's the legal backdrop there. You've mentioned Fourth Amendment search and seizure. You also mentioned due process, whether that's substantive process toward privacy or actual getting in front of court. I just want to highlight two things. To the extent your argument depends on understanding of Fourth Amendment law, Fourth Amendment law is very much judge-made. So to the extent that statutes try to embody procedures or some kind of governance that happens in the organization, that doesn't change the trunk of the tree, which is judge-made law. Because it's judge-made law, the goalposts aren't on wheels, but it's in mud. So there's been shifts, and there's a little bit of back and forth that happens there over a longer amount of time. The second idea is in terms of due process. How you think about this, due process is not the same thing in different venues. So there are certain kinds of remedies that cannot be had in agency proceedings. For example, punitive damages, they must be in courts. So in terms of when you think about what remedies are, where you have to go, there are substantial differences based upon what your ideas really is.
Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I just have a part question, part comment. In your presentation, you used the word digital self. And I was wondering, like, how digital self, why you insist on digital self instead of digital subject? Because, you know, then the subject has this kind of a double meaning of, you know, agency and subjectification at the same time. And if you want to, because you're thinking about governance, so it's like it is already always in relationship with an authority. So it should probably be a subject than self, because self, especially self, you know, the concept of self then sort of invokes certain original self or a body that kind of you could go back to and pin all the reality on, or the ideas of sort of, you know, representability and stuff. And then, like, building on that, I was thinking, like, you know, there were similar anxieties about census taking in India. So, for example, there's this idea that, you know, there were people who didn't know they were Muslim unless census taking started. Then, you know, you think about, for example, 1960s in Europe, and like think with Althusser about ideological state of practices and oppressive state of practices, and how subjects are interpellated, which is kind of, you know, has the similar understanding of how subjects are being made and created as data doubles there, right? Here, the political subjects are collected through state, ideological state of practices and oppressive state of practices, right? So I was just wondering if you want to sort of think about those, like how this moment is different than just the continuation of intensification of technologies of governance.
And we have, just a few minutes, I think, two.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but hopefully we will
yeah.
continue more conversations.
So, and I invite, if anybody, I love talking about this. So if anybody is interested in continuing a conversation, I would love that. I think what was interesting about the challenge of this presentation for this particular group was I hadn't really dived into the literature on governance specifically in the expertise at the Ostrom workshop. And so as I was putting together, because I write mostly from a geographical and a STS, science and technology studies background. And so to actually try to use different frameworks of governance, like I was looking at the IAD framework, all these different things that, so to your point about how I'm thinking about governance, like even dividing it into just for a thought process, dividing it into different things to see how, how it impacts things positively, negatively, in the middle, all of that spectrum, I think has been really helpful, especially as I think through some of the case studies. And I'm trying, there's a lot of questions, which is great. Yeah, no, fantastic questions. And I think this has been really helpful in terms of through it and then hearing some of your comments that I can then go do some more research on. Oh yeah, maybe making this difference between interoperability and data sharing more explicit, and how that, how do I explain that, and what am I actually meaning strengthens the argument overall. Or again, like you were talking about with the Fourth Amendment, like being more explicit on, or how heavily am I relying on that in terms of my argument, I just think it's helpful to think through some of these things that are unfortunately.
Thank you so much again, Nicole.
Everyone, I really appreciate it.